In some ways, I think this game can be about knowledge and its limits and the nature of consequences and the way in which we can crave so badly to know the outcome of our actions, but in the long run, so many effects are going to be knockoffs and deviations from what we hope. On the basis of our mistakes, on the basis of us in the process of learning, we can make huge mistakes that define our character in such a narrowly horrifying way that we can't even look at what we had done in the past without recoiling at our own choices. One thing that leads to that regret is violence, and then it's the question of what violence is necessary or not. Kratos is a character born of violence, and it's a character trying to deal with violence without actually abandoning it. He seems to notice that he is a model to his son in terms of how to behave. And as a model, he becomes judgmental of his self in terms of what he has been doing. But then he also can't help but do the one thing he's really good at, which is to hurt things. One part of that learning is also what we see in ourselves on the basis of what others are seeing. We have family who show up and teach us something by being in constant reaction to us. The big question at the center of this game, all about apocalypse, is what power do we have in this world to avoid outcomes we fear? So much of the reason why we continuously move forward and do anything is because we have some kind of impulse to empower ourselves via change, and then there are going to be long-term consequences of that. And what happens when you're faced with a fact about yourself that your choices really lead to a certain kind of outcome? And then you have to think, is this who I am then? Am I stuck in this fate? Is this my destiny forever? We want to try to discuss how this game deals with all of that as a kind of a series of myth themes, these stories that are large scale and epic, but also attempt to teach and attempt to gratify in various ways. And so we're going to take God of War Ragnarok seriously. Maybe we'll have a conclusion at the end of this that's worth hearing too. When we return to God of War Ragnarok, we are jumping back into a story half finished. In some ways, when the first God of War came out, it was really 1/3 of the way finished because it was supposed to be a trilogy that was all building up to this final judgment day of Ragnarok where everything was going to come to an end, a final apocalypse. That thread of these 3 games coming together was seemingly a thread of all of these knots being tied up and building toward one single tapestry that you were going to then understand as the full image of this arc of the God of War story, of Kratos, this ghost of Sparta, and the remnants of his life long after the peak, the climax of his story. At the opening of this God of War Ragnarok game, knowing now that this game is going to contain 2 games in one, that it was going to end the trilogy in a duology, we're getting this character who is seemingly very tired from the outset. You see him sitting, looking down at a pouch of Phase, his wife. He seems in a state of reflection, contemplation, and quiet. Kratos, as much as he's a hammer just waiting for a nail in pure strength and just viciousness, and he's just always raging and ready to fight, he also is someone who has done that for such a long stretch of time that at this point he seems quite tired. His balance is not merely one of pure power and the consumption of that power. His balance seems now to be one of wanting to settle down and have a family. It is this moment prior to the big break back into what is guaranteed to be, just based on the title of the game, a kind of series of downward declines into pure chaos, the brimming heat of war. But the game opens in winter, the cold confines of winter having spread throughout all 9 realms. This is Fimbulwinter. According to Norse myth, this is the period of time prior to Ragnarok, where everything is in a state of frozen stillness. Change has been arrested for once. When the game starts, it is supposed to be directly following the last game. There is this conceit that this new reboot of God of War has that the prior games didn't have, which is that the narrative is just running in real time, and you're supposed to be following it like with a handy cam, viewing every single action as if you're there. And in many ways, it's like every event is happening as if you're experiencing it right then, right? There's no skips in the time. This choice to follow these characters continuously, it takes away from typical narrative the molding and bending that creators usually get access to. The thing to understand about all stories is that the thing that makes up a narrative is accumulated action, and the space between those actions can be vast. You could have in a story A girl trips, falls down, cries, runs to her mother, gets a hug, and feels better. And that feels like, okay, that's the full story. But I can take the exact same accumulation of events and I can stretch the narrative time, and I can say a girl falls down and looks at the ground, her eyes begin to well with water, and she wonders, can I handle this? Why am I alone? Where is my mom? And she looks out at the horizon and sees nothing but emptiness and fear. And it's suddenly this drive for her to have to get up and seek her mother and find her and get the reassurance herself, because it didn't come from anything on the outside. It's the exact same accumulation of events, but the narrative time has been stretched. That is what storytelling is you as the creator are deciding, when do I slow down time, when do I elongate, or when do I punctuate. With God of War, we don't have that. We have real time the whole way through. Every node fits. Everything adds up in a way that is necessary. The game is giving the gamer a sense of control by having everything in real time, by having that illusion of knowing. But God of War Ragnarok is actually a break in that rule, because it does begin years later from the last game. This is going to be a game of consequences. You had done so much in the first game. You had built up this world where it was all about you, Kratos, and your son going off on this grand adventure of development and relationship and understanding one another, and Kratos being a very unexperienced father, someone who doesn't quite know how to connect with his own son. He doesn't quite know how to teach in a way that isn't merely him projecting his own expectations onto what his son is. And he was learning how to actually understand that this is a different person in front of him. In the process of that journey, there were decisions that were made, and they were seemingly decisions that had to be made. And this is going to be a theme that comes up throughout this whole game of what are the things that you just have to do? What are things that are required? How much choice do you have in the making of your own life, in the story of your life? In the last game, we had Kratos and Atreus kill Thor's sons and kill the son of the Witch of the Woods, Freya. In so doing, there are two debts now that they are stuck with needing to pay. And the very opening of the game, the expectation is that that first payment is going to come through the hammer of Thor, but suddenly you're attacked by Freya. This is a game reminding you of the ways in which, even if your choices are understandable or realistic or made sense at the time, you're going to have to pay up for them somehow. And that was sort of the first notion at the very, very beginning of okay, this is going to be a game of you dealing with a set of consequences, and we know that it's going to end up in a horrifying place.
At the beginning of this game, it feels like the lesson that Kratos learned at the very end of the original God of War reboot is something that he has to relearn in an even more difficult, challenging way in this game. He had gone through such trials to finally realize that he has to allow his son to make mistakes and not constantly see his son as a vessel for his own hang-ups. Kratos has this desire to make sure that his son can never become like he was back when he was young. And this desire to control is always going to result in unforeseen consequences, especially for the son that you have decided to overprotect. He learns that lesson in a large way throughout that game. He works together with his son. He sees his son as a legitimate agent with whom he can form a team. When he finally makes that decision to then protect Freya, he proves that that lesson also has to apply to the way that we deal with other people who are not just specifically our son. He learned the lesson in small, and now in this game he has to learn it in a wider scale way because he realizes, oh, we shouldn't try to overprotect anyone, not just our offspring. This basically results in the rebellion of the world around him. The world around him is now rebelling against Kratos' supreme desire to control the outcome of everything outside of his home so that he can keep his home exactly the way he wants it. The real tragedy of this is by the consequences of his actions, he has created a dangerous scenario that then rekindles his desire to be overprotective of his son. Now that the stakes are even higher, he is not only no closer to have a healthy relationship to chaos, he also now is going back to his old ways of just trying to be an overprotective father. His son Atreus, who's also known as Loki, has to be this chaotic force that reminds Kratos that you cannot control everything, and also you should not. You should not attempt to because you can't. You should not consider it your responsibility to do the impossible. Time and time again, the characters have to realize that they want things to be one way so badly that they are willing to put themselves in greater and greater debt in life and never pay back those debts until it's too late, because they want to put off the adventure forever, but the adventure always follows them.
This urge for calm is an urge to stop change, which is necessary. And it's a resistance to adapting in the way that you have no choice but to adapt. It's the same problem that Freya didn't seem to understand with her own son, which is that by halting the need for her son to adapt to danger, she's halted his ability to develop in a way that is conducive and fitting with the rest of the world. And of course, that is the exact thing that put him in danger by the end of the first game, and put him in a position where he needed to die at the hands of Kratos. Atreus, being Loki, is this big reveal that happens at the end of the game, and it is an additional archetype that has just been thrown on to this young boy. It's the archetype of the trickster. In folk tales across various cultures, you always find a character who seeps underneath whatever is the cultural moray of the day, the cultural norm, and sees it transparently as a flimsy device. Something that is being used to hold everyone down into one set, organized way of being. And the trickster tends to be able to trick by playing with the expectations that are built from that cultural norm. Whatever beliefs people have about behavior or what it means to speak a certain way or act a certain way, the trickster swoops in and takes advantage of that, because by getting along with everyone else, you are also neutering your ability to think critically about everything, because now you're viewing norms as natural, as that's just the way things are. That simplified way of thinking through life of, oh, if it is the thing that everyone is doing, it must be the right thing. Making the mistake of, in the same way that we will notice patterns in nature and then say, okay, that's natural law. The simplified version of living is to notice patterns in human behavior and think, oh, that must also be natural law. But there's a huge difference whether something must be that way or whether something is just that way in the past, but it doesn't have to be that way in the future. The trickster character is supposed to come in and be that turn in the otherwise smooth trajectory of life. This character who comes in and just upends your expectations, but also teaches you something. Very frustrating character for any character who interacts with him, but a necessary character for anything to go forward. The danger of presuming that norms are natural is because of the fact that they are not natural, you are growing so stagnant as to not be prepared for the fact of the matter, which is that life will continue to change. The world will continue to move on. And the trickster is the character who swoops in and painfully forces us to change. Atreus has this weight of, you are this archetype. You're going to be this character who is going to cause trouble in the world. The expectation for players, I think this is the expectation that the narrative runs on, because this is also what shows up in popular media. The version of Loki that shows up in the Marvel universe is this kind of Loki, which is that, oh, the character who tricks everyone, the character who causes change, it must be a bad person, because only a bad person would do something like that. What is nice about the game is that what Atreus ends up being as he fulfills this trickster archetype is he ends up being not a villainous character, but merely a deviating character, which under a certain light is villainous, but it's reminding us the ways in which, well, that's only within a context of breaking the norm that it's considered bad, but in point of fact, it's not actually bad, it's just change, just difference. But of course, we're so afraid of change, which is why Loki is so dangerous in that way, but it is only dangerous to a status quo. In terms of the long tale of history, it's actually quite necessary. The opening of this game, we are dealing with the outcome of decisions, the ways in which we cannot predict what our actions are going to portend, how that outcome completely can upend our life and cause us to have to react anew in ways that we can't predict or handle. Therefore, it's putting us in the same situation we were in before, where we're again out of control. Then we have this character who is guaranteeing that the world is going to change, that something chaotic is going to exist. And that is this percolating undercurrent in the midst of the narrative. This character has to be changed.
This is a reaffirming of the idea that the trickster archetype is not just what we see it as in comic books. One of the criticisms that certain experts in the comic book world, like Alan Moore, for example, will levy against the tradition is that it sets up this expectation that villains are people who change things and superheroes are people who keep things the same, which is not necessarily a healthy constant for us to be steering ourselves towards. We shouldn't think of the trickster as just our enemy, because there is another side to it. And this game does a good job of showing what that other side is. On one hand, Loki is, like any change at all, something that is not leashed by our expectations and therefore can cause destruction that we don't want. But in the process, it is also not limited by our imagination and can lead to outcomes that are better than anything we could have imagined. Based on what I know of Norse mythology, Loki is, as a character, not someone who wants the best for others, but he doesn't want the worst either. The thing that's interesting about him as a personality is that he just truly enjoys pranks. He enjoys keeping people unbalanced. In the process, he's certainly not a morally righteous character. He's not someone who's trying to make the world a better place. But that's precisely what leads to him gifting the world with things that neither he nor anyone else could have designed. One of the stories from the original Norse poetry that shows this in a huge way is one where it begins with Thor waking up to find that his wife, Sif, has gone bald. So he immediately seeks out Loki because he knows that Loki is the only one who could possibly do something so absurd. And Loki confesses that he did in fact get rid of all of her hair such that it can't even grow back. And he just says that he was drunk and it was funny. In retaliation, Thor says he's going to break every bone in Loki's body every day for the rest of his life. And Loki, just in order to save his own skin, decides that he is going to fix this problem. He explains that the dwarves can create anything. They can create even hair that can grow naturally on a person's head. So he goes down to the dwarves and he tries to get them to create this gift. And he tricks them, of course, in order to do so. At the end of this whole story, they end up producing 6 gifts for the Aesir, many of which are extremely important and essential to a lot of the later stories. One of those gifts is Mjolnir. This is arguably the most famous and most iconic and important of all the individual objects in Norse mythology. And it just comes from Loki's desire to save his own skin and just keep the ball rolling until the chaos lands in his favor. This is what the Norse mythology presents as the essential character of Loki and of chaos as a concept. It will cause trouble in the meantime, but it will eventually land in your favor as long as you are willing to adapt to it.
The deviation is something necessary. That's where we begin. We're being attacked by Freya, and we are having to deal with what we've done. She is the complete villain at the start of this game in the same way that her son was. There is a great stretch where it seems like, okay, Freya is going to be one of your major barriers and you may have to kill her. Atreus, being the young one, being the Loki, being the trickster, being the one who deviates, he does the status quo dumb thing and actually decides to seek out Freya himself and puts his life at risk on this very foolish belief that he can change her mind. Interestingly, being Loki, it actually works. It is irrational in the sense of irrational on the basis of what we think we know. But of course, what we think we know is always limited. And in the case of Kratos, it's limited by his lifetime. He's only lived the life he's lived, which happens to be a particularly violent and a particularly vicious one. It's only through the eyes of someone figuratively newborn, in the sense of not having lived very much in the world quite yet. We have this kid who can actually blindly take risks that lead to not yet known outcomes. It's that surprise that actually leads to potential. That's where we get opportunities for something to blossom that we don't expect. This character has to cause change. So much of your exploration of the world and so much of your engagement with violence in this world is in service of building up to a villain who is at a distance. That villain is this Odin character. One of the most pleasant surprises early on in the game is the choice of voice actor that they chose for Odin, who's this actor who was in the show West Wing. And anyone who doesn't know West Wing, it's a show of constant, rapid-fire, witty dialogue with figures walking as they talk, grabbing things, distracted midway, and it is a perfect distillation of a kind of refined political smoothness of a certain ilk in the world, or at least what we imagine a certain kind of smooth politician style would be. They chose an actor who can play exactly that kind of a person in Odin. An actor who had spent season after season playing this type of character, this type of political aficionado able to walk through a space and command a room and definitely command an argument, persuade in both his tone and the points of his claim. The first time you meet Odin, you know that Odin is supposed to be this faraway villainous figure, and yet he walks into the room and his voice has that kind of grainy softness of someone who's lived plenty of years and is tired of the bullshit.
I think we all have a better idea of who we're dealing with.
Someone who's grown jaded about some of the superficial elements of conversation and seems to just want to jump to the chase. There is something immediately appealing about that. I really liked Odin as soon as he popped up, and he's popping up to get revenge on you and your character, right? He's someone you're not supposed to like, but at the same time, it's very obvious that they picked that actor because the developers want you to like him at least a little bit, or not so much like him a little bit, but at least understand how someone could lead in such a way that they could cause so much destruction in the world. They give you a little bit of a taste of that, of the fact that this character is kind of a cool guy, a little bit likable, in spite of the fact that what he is causing in the world is hugely harmful. They only give you enough of a taste of him at the beginning, so then when you go out to the world, you're then witnessing the pile-on of evidence of the exact kind of harm that he's bringing. So much of the destruction in the different realms that you're going through, when you're exploring Svartalheim, for instance, and seeing the industry that surrounds these poor dwarf figures, and then you start to learn about the history of all these different places, there is just a constant layer of bureaucratic waste and misuse and exploitation. We know that it's coming from this man, this Odin guy. We get a taste of his charm, we wander the world, and we are building up to finally having to face him again. But I like that element. I like the fact that it's understandable why you would be persuaded by him. It's understandable how he could maybe convince you to do something that you maybe think is justified, and then perhaps it's the very thing that's ruining lives at a distance. So much destruction is whatever you're doing at a distance, so long as you're just filling out the numbers. And if you're getting the reassurance of someone who's likable, well, that could be quite a blinding force. And I like that the game is giving a little bit of that kind of taste, of the ways in which sometimes pure evil can be purely charming. And the notion of evil prior to that realization is otherwise very simplified, but they give us a taste of the ways in which the non-simplified version of what evil is a charismatic thing. A charismatic leader coming in and finessing a group and finessing the situation.
Odin enters this game being a subversion of the kind of expectation that was set at the beginning of the first God of War reboot, because that game begins with everything being set in motion by a character who is unable to feel pain and can take an enormous amount of damage and do so unflinchingly and fight forever. He's this violent force that is the linchpin of everything in that game. He is the beginning and the end of that story. But in this game, the main villain enters the story with a discussion. He starts it by flexing his power that way and showing that there's more to controlling people than just holding them down physically. It is from his designs that the actions of the Aesir, the most powerful gods of Asgard, are determined, and from that, all of the other realms are controlled by Odin's design. He uses words as a kind of violence. We're exploring a testament to the power of words to control people. It's in seeing Odin do this at the beginning and throughout the game that we can start to form an argument that a lot of what we associate with the negative consequences of violence comes from not the physical pain or the bleeding or any of those more visible aspects of it, but the controlling of people's agency, right? And the reducing of people's agency. Because he does not lift a finger throughout most of the game, but he is still rightly seen as the source of so much violence.
It turns out to be the perfect parallel to what Kratos is. Kratos is the obvious violence. We're literally playing this character who, for most of the people he's killing, is the absolute villain and fits the mold of what you would fear. He's an intimidating figure, and that's perhaps the empowering element as a player, is you get to take on this role of a pure primal destructive force. And they found a villain who is precisely the opposite of that, but in such a way that is equally, if not more, destructive. Because the tendrils of the institutional pain that Odin can build through his ideas, the spread of those ideas creating systems that destroy in such a wide swath as to not even notice the individual in the process of destroying. It makes for a really nice kind of mirror image. The grim, bold, striking violence that Kratos is doling out on an individual basis, one at a time, is so gory and abhorrent that we can't help but shudder or be impressed by the visual display of its weight. And then Odin is so meek, is precisely the opposite of that stereotype, and yet is exactly the worst figure in this world. It is unavoidable, the effects that this man has done. It's such a great example of just the power of an idea. It's also a great example of the misleading nature of image or charm. When you meet anyone who is charming your socks off, that is a practice that they are now doling out in front of you. That is a choice that they're making. Charm works so well precisely because it feels like we're getting a taste of someone's inner self, and it's like, I love that. I'm impressed by that person. That's who I want to be. But you have to remember how much work goes into something like that. And so when someone is really charming, it behooves you, for your own sake, to maybe break the illusion for a second and remind yourself how much memorization goes into that, how much control is being held over whatever is underneath that, how much is being hidden by that practice. Odin is this great, perfect example of that. Odin, from the outset, before we even begin, he has to be the bad guy. He's the one that we're going to go against. But they're making sure to have the stereotype of the bad guy not actually manifest, so that you can be reminded of maybe the distance between the stereotype and the reality. And that is a pretty important reminder, because it can make certain ideas feel alluring in a variety of ways. But of course, it's precisely because they are simplifying good and evil in such a way to be charming. That is the form of charm. The fact that Odin doesn't fit your stereotype is precisely how he's able to get so much power and so much destruction. Later, we discover the ways in which his family can see that other side of him, and I do think we should talk about the way family can see things differently than others can. But in terms of the masses, the illusion can emerge out of the simplicity of the stereotypes that we have, and the ways in which maybe the bad people don't fit that stereotype. I like that. I like that we're kind of like building up the stereotype and then breaking it. And that's also what Atreus has to learn. We, the player, are going through what naive young Atreus is also having to experience. I'm not saying Atreus is actually naive. I actually think they make Atreus a very smart character. He doesn't fall into the traps that I think most characters of his type would. But I do think they have Odin play with the ways that Atreus himself has to overcome the sentimental inclination to presume that because someone's likable, that must mean they are worth liking. The accomplishment of this characterization that they've done with Odin is that they are capturing the many ways that so much of villainy is at a distance. A lot of the ways in which we engage with what a villain is through a kind of media format. It's encapsulated in a story or a film or a song, and because it's at a distance in that way, it also gets constructed very cleanly, and it ends up fairly flat, where the worst traits of that person are both simplified in order to be efficiently told, but also the most obvious, so to be communicable to a wide swath of audience. It's nice that when Atreus finally enters Asgard, one of the first characters he meets is someone who's on the outside of this grand wall, this wall of separation, this sort of hierarchy in this place. And the villager has a simplified view of the world that he's in. So Atreus is getting a taste of the ways that the charm of Odin can spread and sort of create an ethos that takes over the minds of the populace, which is partly so much of the power of that. But then Atreus meets Heimdall, and Heimdall is actually fitting the villain thing. Heimdall is actually the character who becomes super simplified. He's just such a jerk. He doesn't seem to have any redeeming characteristic. But I love too that Heimdall is this big stereotype, and then there's this point where Odin just pointedly diminishes Heimdall in a second, in just a phrase. It's so cutting, like a scalpel, through that small character's big ego. To me, it's such a significant display of the ways in which the stereotype of evil, the view of what evil is supposed to look like, is often a protection on the part of the individual projecting that out, because they're using that to maybe hide some of their actual weakness. They're using that as a defense mechanism. It's like, if I scare you enough, you don't actually have to go at me or do anything like that. Heimdall sort of just seemed like this character who has a really weak inner sense of self, like a kind of insecurity. And then Odin is the actual character to fear. And precisely for that reason, he doesn't need to present fear outwardly. It's such a great little moment. And then Odin is once again so immediately charming because he just entices this young boy into a kind of haven of a father figure, a different kind of father figure. It's exactly the opposite of Atreus' actual father. Odin gets to woo him into, hey look, I'll look out for you. I'll give you a place. And I trust you. I'm not going to doubt you like your father does. It makes me think of figures that pop up online and the ways in which by offering a safe haven through identity, you can do so much of the work of persuasion. You can cut past so much of the defenses that people should reasonably have. Odin has that quality. He's appealing just enough to Atreus' sense of will and sense of drive. It's cutting in such a way that it's so much more than a blade. You actually use the person now. It's a great use of that character to illustrate the actual danger of someone smart, someone actually capable of affecting the world, not just with a weapon.
This is going to be an important lesson for Atreus, and it always is an important lesson, I think, for any young person to realize the danger of focusing too much on your first impression and on aesthetics and on how things make you feel. Because I think we are all kind of born into this world not having enough information to judge things aside from how they make us feel. When we are infants, like that is the only information we have access to. We don't know why anything is the way it is. We don't know how anything works. We don't know of the gap between short-term realities and long-term planning. How something can seem wrong in the moment because we aren't seeing the long view. And that takes time and it takes experience, a lot of study of the world, to know that there's more to it than just, how does this person make me feel? How does this situation make me feel? Odin is taking advantage of that. He's taking advantage of the allure and the seduction of legitimacy and sensibleness. He has this air of like, well, at least I'm being reasonable, at least I'm turning the other cheek. People who are in a powerful position will always have a greater store of kindness to give, or apparent kindness. They will have more opportunities to take a punch and roll with the punches, and it can make it seem like they are a very generous person. But it's really just that they have deep pockets. It's that they have a well of protection that they can always draw from. And if we're not aware of that imbalance, we will mistake shows of power for shows of kindness. We will focus only on the fact that this feels good, so it must be in some way the forces of light that I'm looking at. This feeling must be a moral goodness rather than just a comfort.
The reason the villains in our stories are stereotypes is not because the lesson in the story is to teach us that's what we should look out for. It's trying to teach us what not to be. Don't strive to be like that person. But the reality of the person who can harm you is not going to be that stereotype. It's often going to be the one who can actually wield power over you. Physical power is very limited because it requires constant mediation and engagement with the thing that you're physically controlling. Ideological power is seemingly limitless. It's the power that changes so much of the world. What I just described about the seduction of the idea over the ground of reality shows up with another character in this story. Odin is this contrast to the expected villain, but then there is another character who Atreus is very eager to meet because he considers this character a savior, someone who's going to bring them out of the misery that they're in and help them deal with Ragnarok. And that is the actual Norse god of war, Tyr. What's interesting to me about Tyr is Tyr represents another ideology. Tyr represents an idea that he holds to fast and is an idea that is very seductive in the same way that Odin might be seductive, and that it is hugely charming. We have Tyr, who understandably is choosing to be a pacifist now. He began as a Norse god of war, and through an overabundance of pain and suffering and destruction, including upon himself, having been chained and locked into a prison, he's now reached the studied position of abhorring all violence and resisting it wholesale. And I would argue that that position is charming in a very similar way to something like Odin. And it's not to say that that's a bad position per se. It is actually a great goal to aim for, given that just like when you're dealing with someone like Odin, you're attentive to what's really happening. Because if you only have the goal of pacifism for pacifism's sake, you can also do what Tyr does, which is through his pacifism happen to fit precisely what Odin wants. When they're all being attacked by various demons that emerge out of a tear in the world, Tyr is on the side not fighting back and actually doing the very thing that Odin would want. they have one less person to help. He's allowing violence and not doing anything to stop violence. If you have violence right there in front of you and you don't stop it, yes, you can rationally appeal to the ideal, but in the reality of the situation, you are allowing a violence that could have not existed. The violence exists because of you and your ideal. Now, that's a delicate subject because I know that there are a lot of incredible examples of pacifism in history, and I'm inclined to appreciate those examples. Figures that I much prefer to the alternative. But it is important to point out the ways in which that pacifism works as a tool of persuasion to then enact change. It would not work if there was not large groups amenable to that persuasion. It kind of requires things already being in place. In the case of Tyr, he is silently and in an isolated form, completely removing himself from action. That, in this case at least, is a form of action and that is actually leading to a lot of destruction. But it looks alluring.
The imprisoned god of war, Tyr, ends up representing yet another example of this idealized goal that Atreus has. He really wants to find Tyr because he thinks that Tyr is part of this prophecy to ultimately defeat Odin. It is another instance in which he buys into this idea that Tyr is extremely authentic and wise because Tyr fits into an established model of what a hero looks like. He is pacifist, and Atreus at this time is kind of in conflict with his father, who represents this man who is overly brutal. He's trying to find other sources of comfort outside of that. He's being made uncomfortable by his dad lately, and he wants to find a source of comfort. This conflict between comfort and discomfort is really interesting to me because as a young man, Atreus is not really aware of how the world works and what ultimately is going to have the best outcome in the long run. So he's judging things in terms of comfort and discomfort. Comfort and satisfaction and suffering and this spectrum of experience is not often very relevant to figuring out what is right and wrong. An example would be like the suffering that is essential to getting physical exercise, right? Like it hurts and it burns, and that's going to require suffering. At this point in time, he associates his dad with suffering, and he's really hurt by his dad. The way that he thinks that his dad judges him too harshly, and he's really comforted by these outside influences. But ultimately, those feelings are kind of misplaced feelings. They're feelings that come from judgment. Because Atreus is making judgments on the basis of how he feels, he's creating a feedback loop basically, whereby the fact that he associates his dad with pain is going to make experiences with his dad painful. And the fact that he associates someone like Tyr with heroism and relief from that pain, he's going to see everything Tyr does as heroic and comforting. He's going to continue to feel that way because he feels that way. It becomes a recursive thing. He can't zoom out and really judge what is Tyr's contribution, which is going to be an important question because Tyr's contribution to the story are not simple. He's not simply going to lead them like a steady leader to the end. He's not just going to make all the right decisions for the sake of the protagonists. Atreus wants Tyr to be a comforting presence, and for that reason, he is a comforting presence.
Atreus' trust in Tyr pinpoints the necessity for putting your ideas in relation to the world as it is. Because the version of Tyr that Atreus is relating to is so much filtered by his idea of how the world should be. My father is representative of some kind of old guard, rough, unfair way of being. A kind of purely destructive force, something that is hamping down other opportunities. The idealistic view is that Tyr represents the movement forward, and Tyr will fit the idea. That's Atreus' hope. Just like Odin is appealing to people's sense of idealism, he's using his charm to show them, oh no, I'm not the ideal villain. I must be something else. I must be a nice guy, because look at how nice I'm acting. Tyr is representative of like, okay, Tyr is a broken down hero. Tyr is a hero who's seen the light. Oh, violence is bad. We should be pacifists now. It is hugely persuasive to stick to your ideal all the way into the end because your ideal is clean. But it is an example, just like earlier we pointed out, there's such a huge difference between the action and the consequence. And you don't fully get to know what those consequences are going to be until you put them into action, till you actually see their results in the world. The results in the case of Tyr is so much of his pacifism ends up falling very directly into the hands of what Odin would want if Odin was there. And then the big reveal prior to the end is that Odin was Tyr the whole time. I think this is perfectly apt and almost funny twist because Odin didn't have to do anything else as Tyr other than just stay pacifist in order to actually accomplish his wishes. And that is a bold way to point out the kind of sad reality of some ideals in the midst of the real world than that. Because Tyr's pacifism is so appealing and you want it to be the way we could all be. Let's just all be pacifists, because of course, if we all were pacifists, it would 100% work. The ways in which certain moral normative acts, when actually instituted across the board, can become self-defeating are very painful to realize. Let's say we all became pacifists. Well, in the day in which the whole world is pacifist, you've now created a huge incentive to be the one who is violent. You've now made it so rational to be violent because everyone else has no experience with violence. And then how are they going to stop you unless they give up their pacifism? It's self-defeating. You have to put the ideal into the world. Tyr, he does exactly what Odin needs to be done. He just doesn't interfere. And it leads to Brock being stabbed and dying. And then, of course, in the moment in which Odin appears and stabs Brock, he uses the appeal of saving Brock as his means of escaping. Because, of course, they can only do one thing at a time. And there's one person who can heal Brock, which is Freya. And instead of using her powers to hold Odin in place, she goes to save Brock. And it's that classic thing of the villain using the good of the good guy against them. But it is just sort of interesting the ways in which our morality can be self-binding. It can be this kind of trap. There's this overarching theme or connection with the ways in which ideas and faced with reality, the ways in which cause and effect, there's a greater distance than we can sometimes appreciate, and it requires really being attentive to what is the world actually. For a portion of the game, we are following this young boy developing as an adult, and part of that development is realizing the world isn't exactly how you see it in your head. It's not exactly the ideal. And that's precisely the character Kratos represents, someone who is so ingrained in the world that ideals are actually heavily lacking in him, and he's learning ideals. So you have Atreus who's fully idealistic learning the world, and you have Kratos who's fully worldly learning ideals. We are maneuvering into a space of balance in that regard. That seems to me the journey up until this point. And one of those balances is evil is not what you think. Evil can have a smile and be quite nice and feel really good. The feeling doesn't necessarily indicate whether it actually is good. It can feel good and be terrible.
One of the most challenging things about figuring out what's good in the world is having to dismiss your own experiences sometimes as a result of receiving more information. Because if we are happy in a situation in which we are delusional about the factors that create that situation, what did it matter that we were happy? If when we discover that things are more complicated and then we find ourselves disgusted by a situation that we were once at home in, to me, what's more valuable then is your opinion with more information, not the opinion you had with less. I think that's important, but I also think there's a mourning of innocence that I experience when I think about that, because there's something kind of sad about having to say to my younger self, who no longer exists, that in some ways his experiences were diluted and his feelings were baseless. And even though those feelings were real and I thought that I was being well guided in my life, I have to also accept as an adult that I can't continue to trust the judgment of that child that I was. I can't keep all of the promises that I made to that child that I was. Otherwise, I am ensuring that I will never truly learn about the world that I live in, and I will instead just dwell on how I thought it was back when I was just feeling my way through it. This is the kind of realization that Atreus has to bear all of the contradictions of the self, and realizing that in order to become a more wise person, you have to argue with yourself. You have to say that you were wrong. You have to, in some way, not pull your punches. Now that you know the truth, that means you didn't before, and that means you have to let go of how you felt. I think that is why a lot of sons and their fathers can have this weird back and forth. A son starts out feeling like a father is just trying to make them feel bad, and then when they get older, they realize that their father was just trying to free them from their delusions in some ways, which is painful.
We also venture into Alfheim and see the remnants of the opposite view. Our criticism of pacifism is not really a criticism of the view wholesale. It's more just within a specific context, there are ways in which pacifism can butt heads with ulterior motives that can undercut it. But so too can war. In this game, we get the glimpse of that through Alfheim. There's a nice dynamic there because when you're in Alfheim, you have Tyr with you, and it feels as if Tyr is tugging along in one direction of the pacifist side of how to live in this space. Very judgmental, looking at the pieces left behind from the war in a kind of affirmation of confidence, like, see how bad this is? And Atreus is witnessing that influence on one side. And then he has his father on the other side, seemingly representing the flip side of that coin. The need for getting things done in the face of imminent threat. Taking threats seriously, not merely as a psychological foible to overcome through conversation, not merely a disagreement of ideology, but actually a fundamental challenge that you have to deal with or die. That's what Kratos seems to be. As you wander through this space and Atreus is fighting with you and Tyr is remaining pacifist alongside and just sort of grumbling the whole way, it does feel like you're getting that taste of Atreus's middle way. Him understanding the limitations of a warlike demeanor, but also understanding the limitations of its opposite. As you're wandering through the Alfheim place, Atreus will every once in a while make a comment about the nature of this war and wondering, do they even know why they fight anymore? They're segmented between light elves and dark elves. It implies a fundamental conflict that can't be overcome. It's an essential conflict. It's in their nature. Oh, you're the light elf. You have to be against the dark elf. It's this like self-justification going back and forth. I like that Atreus is just wandering through, experiencing that, and wondering about it, and he has the privilege of being on the outside, able to be critical of what so many who are in the grind of it have a hard time being removed enough to actually notice. The ways in which this cannot end on this basis. It is so abstracted that there's no stopping it. The beauty of pacifism is it is a means of solving the central problem that is very often at the core of violent conflict, and that is the perception of threat. I need to be violent against you because you're a threat to me. Because I am actually scared, I now have to be the bully. I have to be preemptive to strike you down because I think you're strong enough to kill me if I don't. And the pacifist comes in and as clearly as can be makes a gamble that that is the cause of that conflict. And so the pacifist puts their arms down and is saying, I'm literally willing to sacrifice myself to you. That's how much I am not a threat to you. There's a mistake here and we need to resolve that. That is the power of it. Not only does the pacifist reduce the threat, but the pacifist also tacitly acknowledges a possibility for the person that the pacifist is relinquishing the threat from, allowing the possibility for that person to be redeemed. No matter how harmful that person has been, the pacifist doesn't want to fight them back. And it's suggesting to them, you can stop fighting me now and all is forgiven. We can both stop. And it's that opportunity for forgiveness, the opportunity for redemption, that actually breaks past the label. Maybe the pacifist does have a point, and it just so happens to go very long to get to the ideological root of that point, which is to point out that this problem that we've set ourselves into is one that requires a kind of reset. Because of the nature of this tit for tat that has been going on, one person has to make a huge gamble in order for the reset to happen. And that gamble is to actually put down their arms and offer full redemption to the other side. At some point, you learn about these allies to this character Freya, and there are these two elves that seem to have transcended the violence, transcended the label that binds this group. And again, it emphasizes how much of it is a label, because these sentient beings are fighting on the belief that they have to fight. And then there are two, Bela, a dark elf, and Björnvir, a light elf, who seemingly fall in love. And it's that age-old tale that shows up in stories and myths. This idea of loving your enemy or loving your perceived enemy. Romeo and Juliet, the Capulets and the Montagues, they weren't supposed to see the humanity in one another. And being youthful, being naive, they actually can see past the label and they fall in love. Love is this thing that transcends the moral system of the time. This label that allows for the wars is also a moral thing. It's the right thing to do to be the Capulets and to fight the Montagues. Because you deserve to, because they did something wrong. They deserve what you're about to do to them. You have to stop evil. And it seems like love is this one thing where it's not moral, and that's perhaps one of the best things about it. That's what makes love in a family so valuable. If you adhere to love in your family, you can end up forgiving a monster and actually being the exact reason that person is no longer a monster. You can actually be the opening of the door and to actually let them be a human again. And that is one of the greatest gifts that you can give, and it's a kind of pacifism in a family sphere. I like that they bring that story a little bit. They just hint at it. It's just mentioned in the game about these two elves that fell in love. All of that seems to be something that Kratos is understanding to a certain extent. He seems to see the ways in which he himself is a monster, but also has found love in his life. He fell in love with a woman, and then he had a child, and she's gone, and he has a purpose that's beyond the initial motivation that he had. There's something subtle and beautiful about that. It's a motif that's been recurring throughout the whole game. Kratos is getting past a simplified view of his purpose, but he's also not fully abandoning his purpose. He's still motivated to solve problems. He's still realistic. Because you don't have to be ideological to abandon unnecessary violence, but maybe you just have to have something to love, to be in touch with something real as opposed to just the label. You have, in the case of Kratos, someone whose life has been fully lived long before Atreus comes along, and yet in the existence of Atreus, Kratos discovers something about life and what living can be. Atreus is at the burgeoning starting point of his journey, where he is now blossoming into something that we don't know, and he's being told and restrained by all of these ideas of what he is or what he will be, expectations around him, and sometimes disappointments about the way that he is. And then that becomes its own kind of discovering yourself. Atreus needing to figure out who he is in spite of the fact that everyone else seems to have a picture of him. This is a struggle that is there the whole way through this game, and it touches on a lot of the struggles that we've already been talking about with the nature of redemption, the nature of consequences and dealing with your past actions, the nature of choice and violence, deciding when you need to do something, when something must reach a fever pitch and you must actually act in a potentially destructive way. All of these touch on the limits of what we can know in ways that are easily veiled. There's a lot about family and engagement with family that can be very revealing about the limits of what we can know and some of the difficulties in that. The one thing that I want to circle around to start with is the tenuousness of self, or the tenuousness of who we are, and how much of that is very much an ongoing process of creation in many ways. You are deciding for yourself who you are. You're deciding for yourself, but you're trapped often by those who can't help but see you, whether you like it or not. That creates a kind of knowledge, a kind of information about you. They know who you've been all the way up until any one moment that you check. And so that becomes a restriction on who you could be, because now you have these people who just have an ongoing memory of you. In some ways that creates this kind of expectation that had you been alone, you wouldn't necessarily have. This is the expectation for a kind of consistency. At the outset of this game, Atreus is veering away from his father. He has learned so much from his dad already about hunting and living and choices. The morality that he lives by is very often the same as his father. His choice to be violent alongside his father's choice to also be highly righteous in his struggles. This idea of like, I'm the solver of problems. I need to be there. I need to be engaging with the world all the time. That clearly comes from his dad, and that creates a kind of expectation of how he's going to engage and how he's going to live. So at the beginning of this game, we're exploring this world, and we have this kid with us, and this kid is still trying to know himself, and we know that that's going to require Kratos to let go at various points. So it's like this impending sacrifice, this kind of impending cutting off. A result of what we know about this, about Kratos always being there and always having been there and being a single parent and being sort of the one thing that Atreus is bouncing off of, it makes it especially interesting the ways in which Atreus just holds Kratos' voice forever in his mind. Just anytime, even when Atreus gets to be alone, he's still silently talking to his dad.
I wouldn't have to hide things if he'd just trust me. How can I trust you if you lie? Actually, that's a good point. Maybe if you listen to me. Could I not say the same? Well, where do you think I learned it from?
That is a structure by which he's defining what he can or cannot do. We also get ways in which other people outside of this little family unit, people who are not Kratos, are actually gifts to Atreus in some ways, in the fact that they kind of nudge Atreus out of whatever box he's seemingly been adhered to on the basis of what his dad knows of him. His dad has an expectation of this kid's going to be disciplined in a certain way. And then other characters, early on we have Sindri, who inspires Atreus to deviate in various ways, works with him behind the scenes. That's a shock to Kratos because from Kratos' view, Atreus is just whatever it is that he sees. But the reality of any one person is they are so much more. These other characters become like that little outside mirror. One mirror that ends up interesting is when Atreus meets Angrboda. He seemingly dreams and then enters the giant realm, and while there, we have this girl who sees him with a completely different story attached, because to her, he is not Atreus. To her, he is Loki. So much of her reaction to him is on the basis of a completely different story of who he is. It reminds me of the ways in which sometimes people can see things in us that we don't even notice about ourselves. And she sort of sees in him a kind of power that Kratos wasn't even appreciating. A kind of value that hadn't fully risen to the top yet. But her being so adhered to the prophecy, she saw it as existent now. Whatever that future course is going to be, Atreus is that thing. It turns into this relationship where now Atreus is having someone following him and working with him, but also seeing him as, because he is Loki, a kind of power or a kind of force. Like he is an opportunity for impact on the world that him prior to that point he was not being thrust into or given the chance to fulfill. She isn't trying to resist his prophecy like Kratos is pushing him to. She is trying to get him to actually do the prophecy, which is a prophecy of power, of him being in a place of changing things, actually being this agent in this otherwise fated world.
In some of the conversations between Atreus and Angrboda, I remember an interesting dynamic of Atreus meeting her encouragement with a kind of resistance and discomfort a lot of the time. That probably comes from Atreus seeing this as another form of the same kind of assumptions being put onto him from somebody else. He sees it as a projection, like, oh, this may be a different way of viewing me than my father, but it is just as rigid. Because it is referred to as a prophecy, he doesn't want his story to be set in stone that way. So for a long time, he does not want to be known as Loki. He likes some of the idea of it. He likes the feeling of being new, but the moment that it comes with a certain obligation, then he realizes, oh, in some ways, this is exactly what I was trying to escape. That's the sad thing about seeing the world after being, as most of us are, kind of isolated within a family unit for a long time. There's a learning curve where you don't realize that society is vastly different from your family. Their view of you, it's not going to be what you predict based on how people have reacted to you before, because those people were such a small sample size. It takes him a while to realize that Angrboda is in fact not really trying to put a rigid story on him. Now that he has escaped his father, he is not going to have to fend off a bunch of alternate father figures trying to force him into things. This is something that he can only learn with time, because his experience always, when he gets advice, is that advice coming from an authority. And before he can become his own authority, he has to change the voice in his head from his father to his own voice.
At the outset, when Atreus first meets Angrboda, I initially got the sense, oh, this is like him going from one rigid relationship to another. The rigidity of his father Kratos, and then now her being bound by a story, saying that, oh no, you're gonna fit this thing, you are this prophecy, you have to be this thing. It also illustrates this concept called second order observation. This very basic idea that first order observation is just looking at something in relation to the real thing. So I take a picture of a landscape and it's like, how much does that picture look like a landscape? But second order observation would be to paint a landscape, but not paint it in order to look like a real landscape, but paint it to look like a picture of a landscape, 2 degrees removed. When Atreus meets with Angrboda, she is trying to fit him in relation to the prophecy him. She's not comparing him to anything that she knows about who he actually is. It's not like some real thing. Him fitting isn't by him fitting consistent with his past self, which is what Kratos would expect of him. It's instead fitting with this other storied self. And so it becomes a different kind of pressure on the self, and it's one that I think becomes more relatable now living online when we create profiles. We sort of construct versions of the self. We decide exactly the highlights that are apparent. We decide what words appear, what images appear, and then that becomes our profile. But then that profile is not to fit our real selves, it's to fit some ideals, so it's a second removed. It sounds negative because it sounds like, okay, it's more distant from the true thing. One could argue the true thing is itself a figment, but that's a different discussion. But it's sort of like this idea like, oh, it's distant, so it must be more enchained. But I find it interesting how much Atreus suddenly becomes very positively curious about the story that's being told. He suddenly is trying to find the ways in which, oh, this version of me that you're describing, Angerboda, this one where the Angerboda is looking at him and saying like, oh, you're this thing, and here's all the ways in which you fit this thing. He's suddenly picking and choosing the parts of that maybe are actually kind of appealing. Seeing the version of those events in which maybe that is who I want to be. This is what happens when he goes to Asgard and meets with Odin and Thor and the daughter of Thor, Thrud. And in his interactions with them, he also is suddenly able to fulfill these different expectations based on that. He's discovering the ways in which, through second order separation from the core of something, you actually have more room to play because you are actually making decisions about what that profile is. You're deciding that outer self. It's something that anyone who changes schools when they're middle school or something and they change grades, they immediately discover that as soon as you enter this new school, you don't have to be at all how you were in the last school. You can just be whatever you want. And then they discover that there wasn't really necessarily a version of them. They just so happen to be following whatever the people in the past school were adhering to. It's like, oh no, I can do a new illusion. Atreus is kind of that character in that space. It's the benefit in that case of actually removing yourself from your parent. This is actually one of the challenges of being a parent, is how much of your child's life has to have very little to do with you, and how much of your child's identity is not going to be the identity that you construct by being a parent. Your discipline is really relegated to whatever home space you have, and as soon as the kid leaves, the populace at large is continuously giving the child a palette to then choose from in terms of what that profile is going to be, and that profile then becomes the self. The trouble all of this circles around is how much self is something emergent, something that actually just unconsciously must be decided continuously, and how much after it's been decided, precisely because it is unconscious, we don't realize how much control we actually had over that, and it feels as if it's a permanent thing, like as if it was a thing that you always had. There's a yearning for it to be solid, and I think that desire maybe comes from our parents. Our parents see us and they experience us one way, and if you deviate at all from the thing that they know you as, they comment immediately. That's something that you really discover by leaving, by getting away. That seems like for a parent, that must be really hard. They're showing little bits of that with Kratos. He's so resistant to it in a variety of ways. He gets angry when he finds out what Atreus is doing behind his back. He assumes the worst when Atreus goes to Asgard. Kratos assumes that Atreus would only do that to backstab him. That reveals a kind of insecurity about Kratos and his own son, in terms of Kratos seems to clearly understand that Atreus is not fully encapsulated by what Kratos sees. Think of how much that bond must have been cemented for Kratos, because he's always with his son. Everything seemingly is from the father to the son. And so when Kratos does something different, it's like his insecurity suggests to Kratos, oh, it must be my worst fear. It must be him not liking me. I think so much of Kratos resisting the prophecy is Kratos resisting the fact that Atreus is not going to be what Kratos had been building him up to be. And I think so much of the meaning of the journey is Kratos figuring out that he has to let go at some point, in the sense of the story that he was telling about his own son has to be recognized as itself a figment that he was imposing onto his son. That can only come from Kratos experimenting and trying different things. And this, of course, is a theme that we're going to deal with in the whole game, because the whole game is about where's the room to maneuver? Where does fate come in? And we're all sort of destined for this one thing. The fate that exists in all our lives is often expectation. And so much of what decides the fact that you are the same tomorrow as you were yesterday is because of expectation, and that becomes a kind of fate. But you can break it. And that's something that they discover in this game is, well, how can we break fate? It's not just the fate of the prophecy they have to get out of, it's also the fate of the pressure from your own family, the ways in which they can impose on you so much, and you really have to betray them earnestly and with care and with love for yourself, for a new definition of yourself.
The way Kratos views his son, like anybody, as a specific set of expectations based on not only what Atreus has done, but what he wants Atreus to do. It combines those two things that a self always is. It's always less than and more than a reality. It's less than reality in that it's not solid and it can be changed. It's not inevitable and it's not natural. There is intervention required in order to create a self. But it's also more than a reality in that it's a fiction. Like a fiction, it can be shaped and upheld as long as people want to uphold it. We can remember a story as long as we tell it to the next generation over and over. And if we want to, that fiction can be a reality, or at least something close to a reality because we have painted a picture and we have decided to preserve that picture. The thing about any story that we tell about ourselves, any fiction that we call the self, it is only as useful as our acknowledgement that it is not real. The moment that we stop acknowledging that ourselves and our stories are only true insofar as they are upheld and agreed upon, that's when we start rigidly defending something as if it is an objective reality when we've forgotten that it never was. Because telling fiction and telling stories is such a useful thing. It's like a really unique tool that human beings have that gives us a lot of advantages over any life form that can't tell a story. We have this ability to basically create things that aren't there and then find that we will act as if they are there, and that's incredibly useful sometimes. One example that I often think of is the line in the center of a road. It keeps one lane of traffic flowing in one direction, another lane of traffic flowing in another, and all it is a line. It's literally just paint on the ground, but it acts like a barrier. It can allow us to do things that we couldn't have otherwise. But all of that value almost gets lost and undermined when someone walks up to that line and says, we cannot cross it. It's when we do that we need to remind people that something can be true if we agree upon it, even when it's not real. And it's okay to acknowledge that it's not real. It's for the best that we acknowledge it's not real, even as we continue to uphold the truth for ourselves.
That brings to mind a really important distinction about what we can know about something. Something can be completely fictitious and yet entirely real in its effect, even though it's socially constrained. That social constraint is a real constraint, especially in the case of us, because human beings are social creatures. So much of our definition of living is socially. There's this concept called naive monism. It's this idea of the early view of knowing. And that is that there are natural laws in the world, and you discover natural laws by repeating experiments of cause and effect, and then you see, these things have to always happen. The ball is always going to roll downhill. The sun is going to rise. Water is going to evaporate. You start to notice natural laws. But naive monism takes on the view that there's no distinction between the natural laws and the social laws. So if you say that it is wrong to dress a certain way, and you all wear a certain kind of headdress or a certain kind of outfit, it's been tradition to be that way. The argument from the definers of naive monism is that that is a kind of mixing up two categories of things. You're mixing up natural laws, which are things that cannot change, and you're projecting it onto normative laws, social laws. And you're not noticing that there's a huge difference between the two. They both have a similar quality in that when you're born into a world in which all these social constraints are already there, they feel as ready-made and fully committedly there as any other natural law. So why else would you distinguish? It really takes a bit of work. And then this evolves into naive conventionalism, which is the view that not only are both natural and normative regularities of the same ilk, but they come from something. That's where you get these stories, these godlike stories. The natural laws are created by gods in the same way that the moral laws are created by gods. They're all within the same category, and they have the same weight to them. And that's sort of the power of those stories. When you tell a story about, this is what God tells you to do, that turns it into a natural law. That's what that's doing. When you say God is saying that you have to eat this on this day, you have to do these rituals, these are the ceremonies that God told you. The only weight of that, the only significance of that is in equating between a command and a natural law. What we develop as we remove ourselves from that tribal mindset is what's called critical dualism, which is when we look at those two things and we start to question, wait a minute, we have responsibility for one of these categories that we don't have for the other. The category of the law in terms of legal law, the category in terms of moral law, that is us. That's not the world. It's not a natural law in the same way. Now, what that means is that's a kind of burden. You can't just lay onto it the will of a fiction of the gods. You have to take responsibility for the consequences of it. If you decide that this is going to be the law of our land, for everyone to act this way or to do this thing, you have to now account for it in a way that you didn't have to before. We still hold on to that mistake very often. When someone argues about a social constructed choice, they will often use factual language. You have to do this way. This is how it is. And that becomes the bolster of the argument. So much of those is statements are oughts. They are commands being given, and they are preferences. And they fall into a layer of, this is a decision I'm making, and I think it's best for this, and this reason. But it's being presented in the language of a fact to sway you into that kind of naive monism of thinking it's a natural law in the same way as anything else. And the significance is it's not a natural law, so you can do something about it. In the case of the line on the road, these lines, and they're there, and we all agree to follow this law where we're not going to cross the line unduly. That is an agreement for selfish as much as selfless reasons, because we don't want to die by crossing the line. But it is up to us. There could be a moment where a deer runs onto the road and you just break that rule because something supersedes it, because you have responsibility over it. It's not a natural law like gravity. These stories, these mythologies that make up the cornerstone of even this game, Norse mythology, so many of these stories emerge from a time in which there was that naive conventionalism of wanting to explain both natural and normative laws one and the same. And so they create these tales of gods fighting and fending off different things and imposing rules on us, and it makes it feel inescapable. And if you hear the word naive in front of each of those phrases, naive monism and naive conventionalism, and you think, oh, that's so silly, that's like an early human stupidity. The thing to keep in mind is we still do this with language all the time. We are always placing the categorization of a word onto something and then thinking that it is a fact that it has to be that way. There are ways in which we are very much persuaded by arguments that hold on to it's just how it's been done, as opposed to is this actually the best way that we could do it. You will have to make a choice. You are always stuck with the responsibility of what are you going to do with this. And so fate isn't there, not in the sense that it seems in our stories. We tell ourselves that we have to end up this way, but we are always deciding what we're going to do and who we're going to be. I was recently thinking and talking about ChatGPT, about all the opportunities that come out of this and like, where's this going to lead? And I noticed that in that thinking about it and in that conversation about it, the language I was using was falling into the realm of prophecy. I just was leaning into like, ChatGPT is going to lead to this, and it was all stated as fact. And then I noticed after the fact, oh, how tricky that is. Because the truth is, ChatGPT is whatever it is that we decide, and we're still deciding right now. It's not going to be any of those things without us deciding it's going to be this, this, and this, and this. The temptation, and again, this is the temptation of the fact of us lacking so much knowledge. We are so desperate to know things, and so we are desperate to tell this story. We're desperate to predict the future. Truthfully, it's a much bigger struggle than we realize. And I think that this tethering to self and tethering to normative rules as being the only way to be, Kratos telling Atreus, this is how you're a man, and then Atreus figuring out that, no, I define what a man is. When people are telling him that he's Loki, and he's getting this view of what Loki must be. Well, if I'm Loki, then I decide what Loki is. Loki is whatever I do. That's it. It doesn't have to be anything else. There's something really scary about that power, that actual freedom that's percolating in the midst of us recognizing how much is not as bound as it feels. I think a portion of the story is Atreus toying with that.
This is the really tricky, amazing thing about words, is that even words themselves, we shouldn't assume that they come before their meaning, that they determine the meaning. If we get trapped in the idea that words come with meaning and that they contain meaning, we can start to doubt ourselves rather than just doubting the words we chose. You said you were having a discussion about ChatGPT and you started saying that it is going to be something. In your defense, that does not mean that you thought it actually was going to happen. You did not think that you were literally predicting the future, and yet hearing yourself say the word is made you doubt yourself. Am I trying to predict the future? As if the word was determining your meaning, even though you already knew what you meant? The power of words, like any of these fictions, it's like a game of charades. It's a way of making something happen in the mind of someone else. Just as with charades, there are many interpretations to the movements of a game of charades, and there are many interpretations to our sentences. When we speak to each other, we're not necessarily transferring thoughts directly. It's never going to be that accurate. There's never going to be just one way to interpret what people say. An example of very clever writing that I noticed in the game. When Tyr, Atreus, and Kratos are going through the land of the elves, Alfheim, Atreus asks the both of them, he asks, did we support the right side in this war? And then Tyr says, that's not the right question. And then Kratos finishes that thought by saying, the real question is there a right side to this war? I noticed something that I thought was really clever about that. Kratos and Tyr have almost completely opposite worldviews. Tyr is a pacifist, self-reportedly. Kratos is not a pacifist. There's no way to define him as a pacifist at all. So how is it that they are both agreeing on this phrase, there is no right side to the war? You can emphasize different parts of that phrase. For Kratos, he can emphasize, is there only a single right side to this war? Maybe both sides are right. Whereas Tyr, being the pacifist, believes that they're both wrong. So he's asking, is there any right side? And so they can appear to be in agreement, even though they're saying two completely different things with the same sentence. You have to play a little game with words to make them agree. Words have a lot of power to confuse just as much as they can clarify.
What you're describing is the language game. That's the Wittgenstein concept of a language game, right? It's this thing where because language is necessarily social, it doesn't emerge from one mind. There is no private language, as Wittgenstein points out, because how else would you check if you use the right word for the right concept? The only way to have it be checked is by a social interaction. It has to be an invitation to a thought. So much of what you're doing when you're doing this back and forth is you're inviting the other person to share and play back, and they're going to augment it in their various ways, right? They're going to toy with it, and that's where the surprise comes in, and then you're going to be adapting that, and that's how people can talk past each other sometimes, because the meaning is malleable enough that you can have almost an entire conversation and not realize that you're not fully talking about the same thing, because it just follows the right structure and without the right substance. But it's also why, people comment on lawyer speak. If you read a contract, it's just back-to-back, separate clauses, stacked on clauses, stacked on clauses. And the idea is there's a kind of paranoia precisely because lawyers are combative. When they speak, they are not inviting the other to a thought because they know the other's not going to accept the invite. They know that what the other person's going to do is they're going to actively criticize and challenge every single phrase, and they're going to find the worst interpretation of anything. So the language then changes because now you're trying to preempt all of these possible critiques. It becomes impossible to communicate, which is why so much of miscommunication and so much of misunderstanding, the blame is often given to the other person. Oh, you should have picked your words more carefully. You should have said it this way. That's so much of criticism and moral indignation is how dare you have worded it like that. But a lot of it is like, were you actually trying to accept the invite? Were you in the same context with that person? Maybe that person was in the context where they expected it to be received a certain way precisely because within that context it seemed to them like this was the kind of game we were playing, and maybe you were playing a different game. Perhaps that should be understood a little bit. It doesn't mean people can't say terrible things. Of course, people can be held accountable for what they say. But it is important to understand there is a certain portion of that vitriol that is born of, oh, we're just not playing the same game right now. We're playing two very different things. We're using these words very, very differently. And we just haven't adapted to our own space. It has to be voluntary. It's not going to happen without you volunteering to have it happen. If you want to argue with someone, you can argue forever. That example is so perfect with Tyr and Kratos because they are fully, completely two separate continents in terms of their experience and how they decide to live. And we actually know that Tyr is not even Tyr. It is fun the way that these two different games could maybe utilize the same ball. And it's just like the rules are different, but the field is the same. The object is the same, and it's like, oh, well, I thought you just gained 2 points, and it turns out I just lost 2 points. It's that kind of fun thing. That's the joy of philosophy of language generally, is diving into how much confusion can be wrought by not recognizing which game you're playing.
The problem really does come from the fact that the game is always changing, but the moves don't change. There's almost no limit to how long we can confuse ourselves into thinking that someone is playing a game that they're simply not. They are playing a different game, and we're not paying attention to the right things. This is what happens when people talk about things that are true but not real. In other words, things that are fictional. Part of accepting the invitation that they give you is to play the same game that they're playing and to sort of understand that, like, when I say that Kratos is a father, I'm not saying that Kratos exists. You could accuse me of that, though, if you wanted to not play the game. If you wanted to play a different game of objectivity, you could say, well, are you saying that Kratos is real? And etc. You could argue with me endlessly as I say more and more statements about this fictional character. As long as we can establish that we are talking about truth about a fiction, then we can agree what the word is means in that context.
The word father has a lot of weight. It's like, well, what do you mean by that? Some people would look at Kratos in this game and say he's an awful father. I think that was the line that they were towing in the first God of War when Kratos was taking care of Atreus. They were actively having him be a very rough father to be around. Someone that I think a good portion of the audience probably would look at and be like, you're not the kind of father that I want. The thing is, he's still the father because the definition is malleable. He's doing what he believes is best on the basis of what experience he had, and he's learning, and it takes time. But these words, whether you say Kratos is father and then you have to define what father is, or you say Kratos is Kratos, you are also defining that. And Kratos himself is defining himself in the same way that when you say Atreus is Atreus, Atreus is deciding what that means. When they say Atreus is Loki, Atreus is deciding what that means. Whether you call him Loki or not, nothing changed about him. So much power is given by him being given that name, as if suddenly he's not that same person that you were just talking to. If he ends up doing the thing in the prophecy, that's what he would have done anyway, whether he had the name or not, if it's truly still him. Unless they change some particle in his essence, which seems to be the weight that the word is carrying, it's really just, he's just the same kid, and the kid's gonna grow up, and maybe the kid will do those things. The fact that you called him Loki, it doesn't necessarily have the permanence that the word delivers. But then yes, Kratos is Kratos. We talked about Atreus defining himself. I think Kratos is also discovering a lot about himself. And it's not fully developed. By the end of the game, Kratos is not completely different. He's still the aggressive, monstrous fella that he is. But there are more softer moments in this game than there have been, even in the last one. And the last one was already trying to give Kratos those opportunities. We talked about Atreus gaining opportunity to experiment with himself by leaving his father and by interacting with other people. Kratos gets exactly that too. When Atreus leaves and Kratos is forced to be around Freya for a bit, he ends up talking to Freya about Calliope, about his past life. He relates to her about what it is to have a daughter and to lose your child. That is a very sentimental choice. Because she's breaking down and she wants her revenge, and he opts to just connect with her emotionally, which seems very counter to the kind of connection that he's used to, which is a blade to a gut. It's like an early hint of him just trying to experiment with him, to experiment with Kratos, or also just experiment with what it means to be a father and what it means to be a man. This continues when you explore Alfheim and you're wandering the sands on your little sled. There's these jellyfish-like giants that float through the sky that are all trapped underground. And it's completely optional, it's a little side quest that you can do. But what I liked, and the reason it's memorable to me, is there's this point early on in the side quest when you're doing the journey, and Atreus, understandably on the basis of what he knows about his own father, says, "Are you sure you want to do this?" or something to that effect. He sort of questions, "Why are you going on this side track with me? We don't have to do this. We can stick to making progress." Kratos, he doesn't cloak his feelings. He just says that it's an opportunity to spend more time with his son. It's just a chance to be with you. It's essentially him saying, "I love you."
The thing you're paraphrasing is something that Mimir said. Even he doesn't actually say it. Mimir says it for him and then he confirms it. Mimir, the way he phrased it was, he just wants to spend some time with you, lad. And then Kratos agrees.
That is also the benefit of bringing someone else outside your family into your otherwise closed bubble. Because Mimir is also one of those figures nudging Kratos. Mimir is going through his redemptive arc of trying to reevaluate who he was. And he's also pushing Kratos into that space. That's why Mimir continuously just does joke after joke. And eventually Kratos actually makes a joke himself. But yeah, in that moment, Mimir tees up this opportunity into this closeness that Kratos wouldn't have otherwise accepted. And he just says it. "Yeah, I'm just going to spend time with you." It's a great little moment. To me, that felt like the purpose of doing the whole side thing. Just giving him a chance to have that moment with his son, to change himself. It's not just Atreus changing, it's also Kratos. And how fitting that it happens with the Halfgufa, because that side quest itself, you're freeing these giant jellyfish creatures, and the purpose of freeing them is so then they can meet together. These two creatures finally meet in the sky, and they mate and give birth, and all these little babies are sprinkled out like stars in the night sky. It is fully the sacrifice of the parents for the child. It's this nice symbol of the ways in which Kratos himself had to kill off parts of himself in order to actually be a father to his son. He had to change the things that he had accepted as, in that naively monistic way, those things that he had accepted as natural laws of how to be. And Kratos, in certain ways, is choosing to kill off that part of himself for something that he cares for even more, which is something outside of himself. And what a newly defining self that is. This is part of that process of discovering who you are, is a kind of sacrifice. It is for me relieving to see both of these characters actually deviate from each other and discover something else, because it is also them discovering the ways in which affection can be really restrictive. When you have someone who loves you so much that they are essentially attached to you, that's that codependency of their whole self is defined by being in relation to you and caring for you. That becomes a restriction on you and your ability to deviate and your ability to do more. There's this movie that came out very recently that is amazing called Banshees of Inisherin. It's a slow-paced, highly symbolic film that I'm not going to spoil completely, but I'll just mention the main premise of two friends who've had a ritual for years of just meeting up and spending time together each day. It's just this thing that they've always been doing. And then the movie opens with one of the friends just wanting to stop, wanting to not spend that hour or two hanging out at the bar and chit-chatting. And the entirety of the movie is the other character, the one who is told to stop, not wanting to stop and feeling attacked by the person just wanting to stop this ritual and feeling justified in escalating hurt back because of how hurtful it is for the person to tell them to just, hey, can we just stop? The thing that was so fascinating about that to me is how well it captured the ways that sometimes people can be asking for something so basic as to just be free, and we can take personal offense at it because we had started to define ourselves by being attached to them. So much of even national history has that burden. The Banshees of Inisherin film, it lays its symbolism a little heavy at certain points, but it makes it so that you can get the ways in which someone could really harm someone a lot and really have all the right reasons because they really feel like this is hurting me, and like it's perfectly understandable why they feel hurt. And it can really feel like a betrayal, but it's also perfectly understandable why the other person would just want to leave. What that movie illustrates, it symbolizes countries, it symbolizes cultures, it symbolizes tribes. It also showcases the schism in families. At some point, the kid might want to follow different politics than the parent, might want to believe a different religious belief, might want to just leave, and it can feel like the parent was betrayed, and it's a mistake of interpretation. It's like you're not understanding the ways in which your affection was too binding. In this game, we get to see the ways in which sometimes the most caring thing that you can do is let go. Prophecy is a topic we have to bring up. The basis of the conflict at the center of this journey is a prophecy that seems inevitable and unavoidable. That prophecy is itself inherently destructive. It requires a great deal of sacrifice, and it also builds up an expectation of who the characters are as being rigidly defined and thus unfree and chained. These stories of prophecy are often stories of a kind of judgment day on its way. And that is very fitting with this game because it is God of War Ragnarok, and Ragnarok is itself an apocalyptic end. It is the judgment day. We've gotten these stories for centuries, across generations, across cultures, of a day where all of your actions will come to a head, and this often shows up in religious tradition. And this will be the day when you have to account for all the things that you had done prior to that point. There's a kind of finality there, a sense of an end point. A lot of our stories are oriented around creating this way of looking at events as an accumulation that's building up to this final point. And that makes all events feel smaller in one sense, because when taken at a faraway view, all of those events are merely steps along the way toward an ultimate landing that you're going to stop at. And that's going to make all of those steps have meaning that they wouldn't have otherwise had in isolation. These are the stories we tell. These grand tales. In God of War Ragnarok, they have a story where they know that their world is tunneling toward this endpoint, and some characters are trying to deviate, some characters are being accepting of it, some characters are reluctantly going along because it precisely fits what they want anyway, and some characters are trying to discover the knowledge to change it, because the assumption, at least on the part of someone like Odin, is that through knowledge you can do something about it, that it's really our lack of knowledge, which is a lack of information at play that we don't have access to, and that's the thing that's making us be restricted. If only we had that extra tool of information, we can do a little bit more. These characters have this view of the world that is a view of their world as story. These characters are talking about their lives as part of a story, and it's in the frame of a story. And I also see people. I see people also talk about their lives in a frame of a story. And there's so many ways in which it could make you not appreciate how much it isn't a story, how much the meaning is not set in stone ahead of time. That's something that this game is bringing in to the fore, that sense of fate or permanence.
This Ragnarok idea obviously holds a ton of weight for every character in this game. Every character is obsessed with either bringing it about or stopping it. An apocalypse is not necessarily a fictional concept that has only happened in our imagination. The ends of worlds have happened many times before. Civilizations have crumbled. Ideas have changed irreparably. People have lost traditions, lost languages. There are so many ends of the world that we've actually experienced already. There's no such thing as the post-apocalypse except what we're currently living in. We're always living our lives blissfully unaware of just how much we've lost. Like any ending, it is just the middle of a longer story, and it's just the beginning of a very long story. For most of the main characters of the game, not least of all Atreus, Ragnarok comes and goes. It's just an event that happens near the end of the game, but it leaves the world intact. It leaves opportunities and possibilities intact. And it's only after this apocalypse happens that suddenly there's this moment where Kratos looks at the giant's prophecy about his life, and he starts realizing that there are paths ahead of him that he couldn't have imagined before. This moment where he finds freedom in the post-apocalypse is really an inevitable outcome that people find difficult to grasp in their fear of change. In their fear of change, people will think that an ending is happy or it's terrible, rather than just being a threshold beyond which we can only travel one step at a time and we can only create our future one step at a time. There is no permanent ending. There are only so many endings that just matches how many beginnings we have.
It's of course an understandable temptation to want to see history with an end. We want to see history as a story. We only exist in our relation to memories as stories. Our memories are not every detail we experienced. Our memories are rather an assortment of details we experienced that are then threaded together into a story that we then have access to. Every time we cull our memories back, we are orchestrating it for a particular purpose. We have an inclination to create story. We have an inclination to have history itself be another stage play, and I think the reason why Apocalypse feels like it must be an end to be significant is because, like any stage play, that's the opportunity for good and bad to be decided, for either good to win or bad to win, and then that's the clash, and then we discover something in that moment. So much of God of War Ragnarok is this kind of battle between good and evil, and this is the thing that we talk about a little bit because there are many examples throughout this game of notions of good and evil, and Atreus even questions like, how do we know when we're on the right side? How do we know what is good and what is evil? And I think that the significance of these judgment days, these big apocalypses, is they're supposed to be the point in the story where we say, that's the good who won, or that's the evil who won, or at least it allows us to construct a story around the build-up to that moment of we're the good ones prior to this end, and they're the bad ones prior to that end, and then we can feel somewhat justified in whatever choices we make up until that point. But history is not a stage play. History doesn't have a moral. When we say the word history, we are not referring to one thing. We are referring, just like in the example of memory, to a particular choice that we make to look at particular data in service of what it is that we want to thread together into a story. If I do a history of the Western world, I am making a decision about which pieces of that world are Western, and then the kind of arc that I want to create around that. But that isn't history. History is not one thing. History is not all of the histories of different parts of the world, all the different cultures, they all have their little histories. Even the culmination of all of that is not history. There's no one mind that can actually process that. It is a kind of confusion on the basis of limited knowledge, right? We have limited information, and so we get these stories and we think this is the whole story. You make that point about there being many apocalypses before now. And that is a really, really important idea because it does reflect the way in which there is no one history. It also reflects the complication of the moral play that you want to have prior to the end. Because prior to the end, you're thinking, oh, the good's going to win or the bad's going to win. But the thing that gets really complicated is you and I, for instance, or Kratos, or Atreus, or any character, is only alive because of whatever happened prior. And so if they consider themselves as good, and whatever's in the past, there must be bad things in the past, then that means bad things can lead to very good things. And those things would only exist as a result of those past terrible things. This is a point that Derek Parfit makes in his phenomenal book, Reasons and Persons, that when you start to think carefully about what makes you you, it requires the exact time that you were conceived. Every single factor of the world that existed when you were born had to be exactly that way for you to be the you that you are. If it was even a fraction of a second different, it's a different person. And so that means that every atrocity prior was necessary for you, and you are benefiting from those terrible things. It makes the moral play a much harder play to latch onto, at least latch onto it in a solid way. Because now it's a thing of, when we make a decision about what we're going to do, we are making a decision to sacrifice the alternative world of people. We're not just comparing populations by numbers, and it's like a similar pool of people. No, it's completely different people that we're talking about. That changes the equation a little bit. There have been apocalypses throughout history, and because history doesn't end, they keep going, which means that there is no moral to the story. And we are just so tempted to have there be a moral. And that temptation leads to a view of history that becomes a justified view. Anything goes, so long as we stop this endpoint, because this endpoint is going to be it. This endpoint is going to be the thing that really, really matters. It makes me think about Odin and what he wants. If we take him at his word, he is using Atreus in order to gain information. This information is about what's to come. It's knowledge that he can then use to subvert and escape the Ragnarok prophecy. But this knowledge itself is an ancient knowledge that he's trying to have access to, and it's a knowledge about his origins. He's talking about a knowledge of his own creation. It's again that same habit of the origin is the end. If you just know your origin, you'll know exactly how it's going to end, as if there's no deviation. Of course it looks that way because all the information we have access to is always past-oriented, and when it's past-oriented, there is no deviation because we're looking at it from afar. But the fact of things continuing to happen means that there could be deviations, but of course we would never live in that variety of deviation. We could never get the far enough view to actually see how many deviations there could have been. Odin thinks that by access to this information, by knowing himself better, that that's what you need to make that change, when you can make the change before. The truth is, if you don't want something to happen, then don't do it. It requires a very quick deviation away from your own story. When we finally have the scene where they go down to the Fates, the Norns, who describe why it is that they're latched onto this prophecy and why it is that they're stuck. The reason that they're stuck is because they're stuck in regards to themselves. They view themselves a very specific way. They have particular regrets. The Norns at one point list out each of their regrets. Freya has regrets over her son. Mimir has regrets over the betrayal of his wife in the instance in which he failed to resist Odin's control. Kratos has regret over the loss of his son to Odin's influence. They're saying that there is no such thing as fate, that these things are not set in stone. The thing that is set in stone is your past, the fact that you have these regrets. And this is the thing that's making you stuck. This is the thing that's defining your personality, because of course so much of how we define ourselves is on the basis of whatever we did in the past. Again, that's that story. So the story that we're telling about ourselves is then becoming the origin that we feel we have to be consistent to. truthfully, you don't have to be consistent, but it's very uncomfortable to be inconsistent, to actually break away from all of the accumulation that has built up. This is the way in which the story that God of War Ragnarok is telling, the story that mythology is telling, and folktales, all of these stories about apocalypse and all of these stories about prophecy, the truth in them that they're telling is that we are trapped by something, and it's not magic. What we're trapped by is ourselves and our own minds and our actual past. And the escape from that is a kind of killing of the part of ourselves that needs the story to make sense, that needs the story of who we are to fit. What a wonderful lesson that actually is. And it's a lesson that's the opposite of endings. It's the lesson that there isn't going to be an end, and your beginning doesn't have to match the end, and nothing at any point is a story, and you should abandon that at some point. That's the magic spell that you're under, is this kind of illusion of consistency and storytelling. These characters are learning that this whole thing that the tension is built on, the whole thing that we're afraid of, which is the fate that they can't escape, is their fault. Odin, even himself, seems to be trapped by that. He's afraid of this prophecy. He's desperate because of this prophecy. And he thinks it's going to come from something outside of himself that's going to influence him to get him out of the prophecy. The irony is it seems to be something inside of each individual self. It is actually the notion of self that is leading to that trap.
This trap of the past, described by the Norns as being the only reason that anyone seems to have a fate and the ability to predict their life as a prophecy, is only the trap that it is because of the way that Kratos or Freya or Mimir feel about the past. Even the past really is not set in stone once you realize that you can continue to analyze the past in a new way that changes it for yourself. Kratos seems to realize this by the end of the game. One explicit way that Kratos reframes his regrets is the moment at the end where they've finished having their final battle with Odin, and Atreus is hearing one last speech from Odin about how he can make the right decision and come to Odin's side. And Kratos' response to that is not to shut up Odin, but to just let his son make the decision. And that seems to me the definitive moment where Kratos actually views the past differently, and he stops regretting what he views as an unforgivable mistake on his part. He should have never allowed his son to fall under Odin's influence, is what he thought before, but now in this moment he realizes that he can stop seeing everything as an obstacle to be torn down if he lets people make their own choices and he lets people change. If he allows other people to change, then he will allow himself to change. Because otherwise, if he views Odin as just the enemy, as someone who can only have a terrible influence, then the only logical response in that situation is the same response that he's always had, which is to just destroy. This is him finally demonstrating if trying to prevent fate is what makes us fall into fate, then the only way to see a future that is better than we can imagine is to let things go, is to not be so afraid of the changes that we think we understand in their entirety. He acknowledges his own ignorance and his arrogance about the future. That's the only thing that allows him to create a better future for himself and his son.
It's almost like a freedom to be mistaken, a freedom to accept your limitations to a certain extent. You really are a very small piece in a very big world, and there's a lot of things that you're not going to know, and there's a lot of things you can't control. He is precisely the opposite character, seemingly, to realize that, because he seems like, as a story character, he is a character full of control and power. He's the one who seemingly has always been able to overcome every kind of wall and tear it down and do things that you weren't supposed to be able to do. And the real growth that happens in this game is this is the time when he decides not to be in control, not to control fate, not to control what's to come, precisely because that is a way for him not to be controlled by what he knows. I see so much of the way that Kratos seems to be trying to deal with his mistakes and deal with himself. The ways that he deals with his mistakes by not ignoring them, by not pretending he's someone different, and the ways in which there's this kind of raw nerve honesty to him that is so refreshing in comparison to other redemptive figures who the form of redemption is a kind of abandonment of mistakes, of like, oh look, all these things that I did, I'm not like that anymore. Kratos' attitude is, no, all these things that I did, I'm still like that, but I'm figuring out ways to adapt myself based on what I want and what I think is best. I'm not fully changing. That, to me, seems like a very real version of what a prophecy is. A prophecy is a suggestion that there is something that you cannot escape from, and you're heading straight toward it. In a seemingly opposite way, your past is something that you cannot escape from, and because the past has consequences, that can feel as if your fate is stuck. These characters, by struggling with fate, are in a lot of ways trying to escape from a story that they don't want to have to tell, or they don't want to have told. In the belief that history has an arc, there is a belief that, okay, I can decide whether this arc appeals to me in terms of the righteous good or bad that I see, in terms of whatever I define as the justice of this space. But there is more to it than that. The main characters of this story are not the only ones who are contending with the weight of history and the weight of choice and how difficult that weight can be. There are sometimes, and this is perhaps most true in the midst of calamity, there are sometimes characters perhaps smaller in stature, both figuratively and literally, who struggle in the face of all the bombast and over-the-top moral play that we talk about, the thing that looks good on stage. And there are characters who perhaps can't be quite so seen, but who struggle in ways that maybe, precisely because they are less seen, are more real. They don't get the luxury of alternatives or the luxury of other fixes like those in power or those with attention would receive.
At the end of the day, this story is about the human mistakes that people make. There is no human element that gets ignored in this game. There are no faceless merchants. The people who you're interacting with in order to upgrade your armor and weapons are just as important as the heroes themselves. This dwarf, Sindri, who is one of the people who builds all of your armor and weapons throughout the game, along with his brother, Brock, has to face the consequences of his own actions. He made a decision regarding his brother Brock that seems like a really extreme decision, but also a very understandable one. Brock had been killed and Sindri managed to keep him alive and delay his death. Death being an example of a fate that is not man-made. It's a very real thing that is permanent and very binding. But Sindri approaches it in a very human way. Of course, he does not want his brother to die, and he knows of a solution. So, very understandably, he tries to cheat death for the sake of his brother and for the sake of himself. He doesn't want to grieve him. He undergoes a process that splits one piece of Brock's soul away from the other three parts. This is the part of his soul called direction. This is the part of your soul that guides you to the afterlife. Without this part, your soul would be wandering and have nowhere to go after you die. So he takes this part away from his brother in order to give him more life. This results in a kind of ending for Sindri that is very separate from the other endings in this game. It's a very tragic ending, and it appeals to me a lot because I just like the idea of just playing with what you can do with the final note of a story to kind of make an interesting point, rather than just release tension. Sindri ends this game with a scowl on his face. The very last moment that you see is a close-up on his face as he looks at the shattered remains of Odin's soul, and then he just teleports somewhere else, and that's the end of it. He clearly is not satisfied by it. It's just the only thing he could think to do in the moment. I love that the writers of this game were able to have what feels like a detour in this story, because it doesn't really relate to the plot very much at all. The story wraps up without Sindri. Odin is already trapped, everybody has basically gotten what they wanted. And so to put Sindri in that final moment is to acknowledge his presence in a way that just pays respect to his story, even if it totally wasn't necessary. His story is basically one where he robs his brother of an afterlife, and he knows that really the terrible thing that happened to his brother just a few scenes before, where he was stabbed by Odin, is the exact scenario that it is only because of Sindri's actions. It would just be any other death. They've seen it many times, but it's the worst kind of death because of Sindri. So he has no one to blame but himself, which is why it makes a lot of sense that he spends his last section of the game just very angry. We've covered before in previous videos, such as the Omori video, talking about how a tragedy that is in large part your fault or related to your actions can create the worst kind of grieving because it's interwoven with your own shame. So that outcome was really unavoidable, and it was just something that Sindri was trying to delay and not think about for as long as he could. But no matter what he wanted, there was this binding contract with reality that couldn't be broken. He had to face not just his fate, but Brock's fate. In some ways, the story is about finding your way, which is always an important part of growing up. So it's fitting that this story that centers so much around Atreus would be about overcoming your own past and overcoming your shortcomings. It also acknowledges the times when our weakness is that we aren't willing to simply be changed and simply have our way directed by our circumstance. Sometimes that's the only choice we have.
We talked about the multiple apocalypses that can be glossed over. The fact that clearly Ragnarok is signifying an end, but it is seemingly an end among many, and there is going to be a whole set of lifetimes that are coming long after. And so in some ways, Ragnarok, the apocalypse that is impending, becomes a kind of tepid finish. For any number of these characters who die in glorious battle, who are sacrificed for this greater cause of this big story, you know that they end up in some other realm. Valhalla or Helheim. And there's this idea that the end is a new kind of beginning for something else. And so in one way, the ending we've been talking about, this thing that this whole game is circling around, this Ragnarok, is really an illusion of a finish. It's just a finish of a certain kind of story, and then we're going to start another one. It's fitting and a nice parallel structure that's happening, where you have, just like how Kratos is suffering the consequences of his past choices and trying to make decisions on that basis, just like Atreus is running farther and farther afield from his ancestral predisposition, from his heir to a certain kind of throne that maybe he doesn't want. You have all these characters trying to move forward on the basis of what they had done. We also have this parallel character who is a side character, who is someone along the margins, but who is actually dealing with a real consequence he cannot escape. You could have death in this game and have it reemerge in some grand story, and they found a way out. But Sindri condemns his brother by a choice born of love. It's the perfect kind of choice for this game, because so much of what we're following is characters who suffer on the basis of what they care for. Odin has a love of knowledge, Kratos loves his son, Freya loved her son, and all the suffering that came from that. And you have these characters who, due to a need to protect something, they end up having to suffer. And so Sindri needed to protect his brother. He did not want his brother to be lost forever. Sindri, for the sake of saving his brother, condemns his brother to an actual end in which he cannot be saved. The character who actually is dealing with a real consequence doesn't have the luxury of being a nice guy about it. He gets to be really hurt and really seriously offended and unforgiving. He gets to be relentless in the fact of the matter, which is, this isn't a nice story. I don't like this, and I don't have to act like I need to be the good guy to overcome anything. I'll do the things that I agree with doing. I'll follow through on some promises I had made, I'll show up, but I'm not going to be the hero in another story like all of you get to be, because you perhaps have the luxury of being heroes in a story, and you have all the narrative protection that story offers, and I don't. The thing that matters to me, I lost. That to me is the part that rings most true to the prophetic in actual life, the part of living that does not have control, and that is death. We have a character in the midst of a grand fiction, a mythological odyssey, all this incredible magic and journeys left and right, different realms, wide mixture of enemies and characters to deal with, and it's all within the fantasy where consequences are of course loose, but then they bring in the real final thing to fear in fate, which is death, and it's the one thing that isn't actually fiction, in the sense that it's fully shared with what real life actually is. That is something that we all can't avoid. That is perhaps the one certainty in an otherwise varied and complex life.